There is a document most men sign once in their lives. It is called a mortgage. You sign it when you are young and hopeful, and you spend the next 30 years paying it off. And the day it is finally clear, the day you own your home without debt, feels like something permanent and irreversible. Victor Ingram paid off his San Francisco home in 2019. In 2023, he signed a new mortgage on it. The money went to Manila. Every dollar is gone. The mortgage remains. The escrow closed on a Wednesday. I remember sitting at the title company office in San Francisco with the documents in front of me, and I remember the escrow officer, a young woman named Karen who had probably processed 100 of these, sliding the signature page across the desk with the same routine efficiency she would have used for anyone. She didn't know she was watching a 72-year-old man borrow $465,000 against a house he had owned free and clear for 4 years. She didn't know the money was going to Manila. She didn't know any of it. I signed. Karen said, "Funds will be available Thursday morning." I said, "Thank you." And that was how the worst decision of my life was completed. Not in a shouting match, not in a moment of obvious madness, but in a quiet office with fluorescent lighting and a potted plant in the corner, with a pen and a signature, and a polite exchange about fund timing. I need to explain who I was before I can explain how I got to that table. My name is Victor Ingram. I spent 37 years in property development in the Bay Area. Not the glamorous end of it, not the tech campus megaprojects. Residential development primarily. Mid-market housing in the East Bay and South Bay, the kind of projects that require patience and regulatory navigation and a tolerance for the specific grinding pace of California permitting. I built a company with my partner Ray Stillwell starting in 1985, and when we sold it in 2019, I walked away with enough to be comfortable for the rest of my life, assuming I didn't do anything foolish with it. I did something foolish with it. My ex-wife Linda and I divorced in 2014, not bitterly. We had been two people who built something together and then grew in different directions, which is a gentle way of saying that by the time our son Garrett was through college, we had been maintaining a marriage on the strength of shared history rather than shared present. The divorce was civil. The house in San Francisco's Glen Park neighborhood went to me as part of the settlement, and Linda took a condo in Marin that she has been happy in, and we have managed an ongoing cordial relationship, primarily because Garrett needs us both and deserves not to have parents who make that complicated. Garrett is 44. He lives in Oakland, works in tech, and has a wife named Simone and a daughter named Ruthie who is 6, and who I see whenever I can arrange it. Garrett is not close to me in the effortless way that some fathers and sons are close. We have to work at it. The working at it has produced something real, but it requires maintenance, and one of the things I lost in the Philippine situation is some of that maintenance, some of the credibility and stability that had been the foundation of our improving relationship. I went to the Philippines for the first time at 70, when a friend from the industry, a man named Walt Deering, who had retired to Cebu, flew me out for 2 weeks, saying he had something he wanted to show me. What he showed me was a property market that was, in Walt's description, 20 years behind where California had been in 1985. "You'd know exactly how to read this," he said. "You've already done everything that's about to happen here." Walt was right that I could read the market, the supply-demand dynamics, the infrastructure investment signals, the regulatory environment. It was familiar language, familiar patterns, familiar enough that I felt the specific excitement of a professional who has found a use for skills that retirement had made irrelevant. I spent 2 weeks looking at projects with Walt, and came home thinking in a way I hadn't thought in 4 years. On my second trip, Walt introduced me to Ursula Reyes. She was a realtor, a licensed property agent who worked with foreign investors looking to enter the Philippine residential and commercial market. She was 46, precise in her professional presentation, and had a portfolio that included projects across Metro Manila and several provinces. She spoke the language of property development without translation, absorption rates, zoning classifications, title transfer mechanics, the particular considerations of foreign ownership structures under Philippine law. We spent 3 days looking at projects together, with Walt present for 2 of them. She knew her inventory well. She asked good questions. She did not push. By the 3rd day, when Walt had bowed out to attend to his own affairs, I was comfortable enough with her professional competence to have an extended conversation about what the Philippine market was actually offering to a foreign investor who understood residential development. The opportunity that most people miss, she said, over lunch on that 3rd day, is mixed use. The residential story is well known now. Too many people competing for the same plays. But mixed use in secondary cities, Lipa, San Fernando, Batangas City, that's where the fundamentals are strong and the competition is thin. I knew exactly what she was describing. I had identified the same dynamic in the East Bay in the early 90s. Secondary locations adjacent to primary demand drivers, before everyone else noticed them. I had made significant money on that read. "Show me," I said. She showed me. Over the following 2 visits to the Philippines, each one a week long, spaced about 6 weeks apart, she presented 3 mixed-use development opportunities in secondary Luzon cities. The documentation was professional. Site assessments, feasibility studies, pre-commitment letters from anchor tenants. She had a development partner for each, a Philippine property group that had existing projects I could physically visit, which I did. The projects were real. The company was real. The principals of the company met with me and spoke with the authority and knowledge of people who had built things. I want to be precise about this because it matters enormously. The fraud that was done to me was not a fake company with a fake website and a fake office. It was a real company, being used as an introduction mechanism for a separate entity that did not exist and never would. The development partner I met was legitimate. The projects I visited were legitimate. The opportunity I was being pointed toward was neither. The opportunity Ursula presented was not one of the 3 projects she had shown me. It came forth, presented as something separate. A pre-development consortium position in a mixed-use project in Batangas City that was being assembled by a group of investors before the formal development entity was established. The consortium was seeking 1 additional foreign capital partner. The entry price was $465,000. The terms provided a preferred return structure and an exit path through a public listing that the consortium expected within 3 years. The documentation for this opportunity was also extensive. A consortium agreement, a capital waterfall structure, bios of the co-investors, independent market analysis from a Manila consultancy, a legal opinion letter from a Philippine law firm regarding the investment structure and foreign investor protections. I read all of it. I read it as someone who has read 1,000 pieces of investment documentation over 37 years. I found nothing that disqualified it. What I did not do was hire an independent advisor to verify it from scratch. I had 2 reasons for this, both of which I understand now were rationalizations rather than reasons. The first was that Walt had vouched for Ursula's professionalism and track record, which I treated as due diligence on the introducer rather than on the specific opportunity. The second was that I was excited, the professional excitement of someone who has found what feels like a market red they have been waiting for, and who knows from experience that the window on these things can close before deliberation finishes. Excitement is not compatible with careful analysis. I know that. I knew it professionally. I did not apply it personally. I called Garrett to tell him about the opportunity. Not to ask his opinion, I want to be honest about that. I called to share it, with a father's instinct to include his son in something he felt good about. Garrett listened. He asked sensible questions, the kind I would have asked in his position. What is the liquidity path? Who are the other co-investors? What independent verification have you done? I answered the questions I could answer, and said I was still working through the others. "Dad," he said, "please don't move anything significant until you've had someone independent look at this." "I'm being careful," I said. "I know you think you are," he said. That was the moment. That exact sentence. "I know you think you are." The moment where someone who knows you well enough to see around your blind spots says the thing clearly enough that there is no ambiguity about what they mean, and you hear it, and you set it aside anyway because the excitement is louder. I set it aside. The reason the California house was involved, the reason I did not simply write a check from my investment accounts, was a tax and liquidity structure that Ursula had suggested. She explained it in the language of a professional who understood U.S. tax treatment of investment capital. Drawing down investment accounts at my age and income level would have triggered immediate tax consequences, whereas a cash-out refinance on a primary residence produced capital that was not a taxable event at the point of distribution, with the carrying cost of the mortgage more than offset by the anticipated consortium returns. This was, in its technical description, not wrong. The tax mechanics she described were real, and the reasoning was sound as far as it went. What it was not was the right structure for me to put money into an unverified Philippine investment consortium. But I heard the professional logic and I processed it as professional advice rather than as a framing device designed to produce a specific outcome. I engaged a mortgage broker in San Francisco, a woman named Denise Chow, who I had worked with twice before on development projects. She processed the refinance on the Glen Park house without question, because it was a legitimate loan on a legitimate asset with a borrower who had excellent credit and verifiable income. From her perspective, it was a clean transaction. The funds cleared on a Thursday morning. By Friday afternoon, I had initiated the international wire transfer to the consortium account Ursula had provided. A Philippine account, in the name of an entity I had documentation for, managed by a trustee arrangement that the legal opinion letter had addressed. The wire confirmed on Monday. The first sign that something was wrong came 6 weeks later, when I requested the first quarterly investor update that the consortium agreement had specified. I received a brief message from an email address associated with the consortium saying that the update was being compiled and would be sent within 2 weeks. It was not sent within 2 weeks. I contacted Ursula. She said she had been trying to reach the consortium administrator and was getting slow responses. She said these things sometimes happened in the early stages of a consortium before the management structure was fully formalized. She was calm. She was professional. She did not seem alarmed, which I read as reassurance. I gave it another 3 weeks. No update arrived. I contacted Ursula again. This time her response was slower. 24 hours instead of the same-day turnaround I had come to expect. "I'm following up," she said. "I share your frustration. This is not the communication standard I was led to expect." That phrase, "I was led to expect," was the first moment I heard something off in her language. The slight distance of it. The passive construction that placed her alongside me, rather than as the person who had brought me to this. I had spent 37 years in development deals, and I knew what it sounded like when someone was beginning to manage their exposure. I called Walt. Walt had been retired in Cebu for 6 years and had dealt with Ursula on his own smaller investment activities. He was genuinely puzzled by what I described. He said he had no knowledge of the consortium or the Batangas City project. He said the development partner company I had mentioned was real, but he had not known Ursula was presenting any consortium opportunities connected to them. "That's separate from anything she showed me," he said. "Victor, the projects I saw her work on were straightforward resale and rental properties. I didn't know she was in pre-development consortium work." I said, "Do you think she's legitimate?" A pause. "I thought so," he said. "I still think the basic business is real, but I don't know about this specific thing. I'm sorry. I should have asked more questions when I introduced you." I engaged a Manila attorney named Attorney Francisco Evangelio, found through the American Chamber of Commerce's legal referral network in the Philippines, and a U.S.-based international fraud attorney named Catherine Brewer, who had been recommended by a property attorney I knew in San Francisco. Between them, over a period of 6 weeks, the picture assembled. The consortium entity was a shell. The account I had wired to had received funds from 3 other foreign investors in the preceding 18 months before my own transfer. Similar amounts, similar profile of investors, similar documentation presented. 2 of those investors had already filed complaints. The legal opinion letter had been issued by a real Philippine law firm, but addressed a hypothetical structure rather than the actual one. the firm confirmed, when attorney Evangelio contacted them, that they had no ongoing engagement with the consortium entity and that the letter had been commissioned as a general structural opinion that had then been repurposed without their knowledge. The development partner company, the real company whose projects I had visited, had no relationship with the consortium whatsoever. Their name had been used in the documentation without their knowledge. When Adi Evangelio contacted them, they were concerned and cooperative. Ursula Reyes's real estate license was valid, and she had a genuine business. What Adi Evangelio's investigation suggested, though stopping short of what would constitute legal proof, was that she was functioning as an introducer for the consortium operation, bringing credentialed foreign investors to a scheme that used her professional legitimacy as the front surface of something substantially less legitimate behind it. Whether she was a knowing participant or a sophisticated victim herself was something the investigation could not establish cleanly. That uncertainty made the Manila process complicated. Attorney Evangelio filed the complaint. The NBI opened an inquiry. The investigation was ongoing as of my last update from him. What was not uncertain was the $465,000. It was gone. Attorney Evangelio was direct with me. The consortium account had been cleared through multiple intermediary structures within 72 hours of receiving each investor's funds. Tracing it to a recoverable endpoint was a legal process that could take years and might produce nothing. He had seen this pattern before. The mortgage on my San Francisco house was due in monthly payments that started in November. 47 months after the refinance closed, I would have been responsible for enough monthly payments to understand exactly what I had done. I had pledged the paid-off home I had worked 37 years to own free and clear against money that had vanished into a Manila account that no longer existed. I called Garrett on a Tuesday evening, sitting in the Glen Park house, in the living room where he had grown up, looking at the wall where family photographs had hung for 25 years, and where I had arranged things without really noticing the arrangement. "I need to tell you something," I said. He was quiet in the way he gets when something is coming that he has been half expecting. I told him everything: the consortium, the documentation, the wire, the subsequent discovery, the ongoing NBI investigation, the mortgage that now sat against the house we were both sitting inside the history of. He did not interrupt. When I finished, the silence ran for longer than felt comfortable, and then he said, "The house." "Yes," I said. "The house has a mortgage on it now." "Yes. Because of this." "Yes." Another pause. Then, "Dad, why didn't you call me before you wired the money?" "I called you beforehand," I said. "I told you about the opportunity." "You told me about it," he said. "You didn't call me before you wired. That's different." He was right. There had been a window, a week between the mortgage closing and the wire transfer, when I could have called Garrett and said, "I'm about to do this. I want to talk it through one more time." I had not made that call because I had not wanted to have that conversation. I had known, at some level I was not looking at directly, that he would have slowed me down, and I had not wanted to be slowed down. "You're right," I said. "I didn't call you." He made a sound that was not a word, the sound of someone absorbing something and deciding how to hold it. "What are you going to do about the mortgage?" he said. "I can service it," I said. "My pension and investment income cover it with some adjustment to my spending. It's not comfortable, but it's manageable." "For how long?" "It's a 15-year term," I said. Another silence. "I am 72 years old, and I have taken out a 15-year mortgage, and my son is doing the arithmetic that I was doing myself, which ends in the same place. If I live to the end of the term, I will be 87, and the payments will have consumed a meaningful portion of what I intended to leave him." "I'm sorry," I said. "I know what this means for the future." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I don't care about the inheritance, Dad. I care about you." A pause. "I just want you to be honest with me from now on. About what's happening. About everything." I told him I would be. I called Simone the next day, Garrett's wife, because I felt she deserved to know directly, rather than through a filtered version from Garrett. She was composed and kind, and said the thing that surprised me most. Victor, I need you to know that none of us are going to judge you for this. We just want you to be okay. I sat with that for a while after I hung up. The generosity of it was harder to receive than judgment would have been. Catherine Brewer, my U.S. attorney, worked the domestic angle, investigating whether any of the documentation presented to me had violated U.S. securities laws by virtue of being presented to a U.S. citizen, which was a potential federal angle she thought worth exploring. She was cautious about the prospects, but thorough in her process. She also did something I had not asked her to do, but which turned out to be valuable. She connected me with 2 other investors who had been defrauded by the same consortium operation and who were now coordinating their complaints to provide a more substantial evidence base to the Philippine and potentially U.S. authorities. I spoke to both of them by video. One was a retired engineer from Seattle named Don, 68, who had invested $380,000. The other was a Canadian from Vancouver, a man named Keith, 65, who had lost $290,000. Both had been introduced to the consortium through different realtors, with different relationship pathways. Both had been presented with substantially the same documentation. Both had done what I had done, read it carefully, found it credible, and moved faster than caution required because the professional logic was sound and the excitement was real. Talking to Don and Keith did something for me that I had not expected. It did not make the loss easier, but it confirmed something that I had been struggling to accept. I had not simply been naive. I had been targeted by something that was well constructed enough to pass the scrutiny of 3 experienced men in different countries and different fields. That does not absolve me of my choices, but it places the choices inside a more accurate context. Walt came to Manila for a week in the autumn, and we spent 2 evenings going back through everything he knew about Ursula and what he didn't know. He was carrying more of a sense of responsibility than I wanted him to carry, and I tried honestly to help him put it down. You introduced me to a legitimate professional, I told him. What she did with that introduction is not something you could have controlled. He accepted this partially, in the way that people accept things they feel guilty about, acknowledging it intellectually while continuing to feel it viscerally. I have been back in San Francisco since October. The Glen Park house is the same. The mortgage payment is automatic. It leaves my account on the 1st of each month, and I am aware of it, the way you're aware of a weight you've agreed to carry. Not crushing, but present. Ruthie came to stay for a weekend in November. She is 6, and she has no awareness of any of this, and does not need to have any awareness of any of this. And those 2 days were the best 2 days I had in the second half of the year. She climbed on everything and asked questions about everything, and at one point, sitting on my kitchen counter eating grapes while I made lunch, she said, "Grandpa, why do you have so many keys?" Pointing at a hook by the door, where I had accumulated keys to things I no longer even remembered the purpose of. "I collect them," I said. "That's weird," she said. "You're right," I said. She laughed. I laughed. And for that specific moment, the mortgage, and the wire transfer, and the consortium account, and the 15-year payment schedule were in a different room entirely. I want to say what I have learned from this, not as a formula but as honest accounting, because honest accounting is the thing I failed to do before I signed the escrow documents. I knew how to evaluate property investments. I had done it for 37 years. What I did not understand, what I would tell myself now if I could go back to the title company office with Karen and the potted plant and the signature page, is that professional knowledge does not transfer automatically to unfamiliar markets with unfamiliar actors and no independent verification. I read the consortium documentation as though I were reading something produced by people operating within the same accountability structures I had worked inside for my entire career. Philippine regulatory frameworks, legal enforcement mechanisms, the professional consequences of fraud for licensed realtors, these were not the same as California. I applied my California experience to a Manila situation, and the calibration was wrong in ways I could not see, because I had never operated in that environment. The independent verification that Garrett asked me about, "Have you had someone independent look at this?" would have caught what I missed. Attorney, Evangelio, working from scratch, identified the shell entity within 3 weeks. 3 weeks, for a few $1,000s in legal fees, would have protected $465,000 and a 15-year mortgage. I did not spend those 3 weeks, or those few $1,000s, because I was excited, and because excitement and independent verification are structurally incompatible. Excitement produces urgency, and urgency is the enemy of the kind of careful scrutiny that finds the thing hidden inside the credible surface. Ursula understood that. She introduced the consortium opportunity only after 3 prior visits had established a professional relationship substantial enough that her judgment felt like a credential. She presented documentation extensive enough to satisfy scrutiny from inside the relationship, but not from outside it. She managed the timing so that the window she mentioned, a limited period, before the consortium was closed to new investors, created the urgency that foreclosed independent review. Every element was calibrated, and my professional confidence was the lever it was calibrated to work on. The NBI investigation is ongoing. Catherine Brewer's federal angle is being assessed. The 3-investor coordination is producing a more complete evidentiary picture. Attorney Evangelio is cautiously optimistic about the criminal complaint advancing. None of this changes the mortgage. None of this returns the $465,000. But it is something. Garrett calls every Sunday now, not with the maintained, effortful regularity of before, with something more natural, less managed. The conversation last Sunday was about nothing in particular. His work, Ruthie's school, a book I had been reading, the state of the Bay Area housing market, which I still have opinions about and still cannot entirely prevent myself from sharing. He asked, at the end, how I was doing. I told him the honest version. He said, "Okay, good. Call me if anything changes." That is the relationship I have now with my son, not the one I wanted to build by being sharp and capable, and showing him I still knew how to read a market. The one that grew from showing him I could be honest about failure. It is better than what I had before. It cost $465,000 and a 15-year mortgage to build it, which is an absurd price for something that was always available for free. But I have it now, and I am holding on to it. The keys on the hook by the door. I went through them last week, counted them, threw away the ones I couldn't identify, kept the ones I knew. That seemed like the right thing to do.